Chairman, guys, Chairman Pruitt will be back in a minute. We'll start as soon as he gets here. What's that? You need to go get a top of Paul. We'll strip Dubnik's bill and put your stuff on it. Dubnik's bill from last year that they stripped and put baiting on over there. We'll amend it here and put DMAP and air guns on it. And the department update.
Clean up
That was the dumbass behind. Wait for it. What happened? Shot. I don't know if Jimmy's taking a break or not, but we're gonna start it off. I tell you what, we don't usually. I sometimes forget or usually don't, but we're gonna open up a prayer. I just learned about Butch Parrish's wife and her diagnosis. Butch Parrish's wife was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I am. I tell you what. Would you do start us with a prayer?
Yes, sir. Dear Heavenly Father, we lift you up, Lord, and we praise your name. We just pray, Heavenly Father, that you be with each person here, watch over us, protect us, be with our families. We pray, Heavenly Father, for Butch and his wife, that, Lord, you'll comfort them and that you'll hold her. We pray, Lord, that all things we know you are in control of. We turn them over to you. In Jesus' precious name, amen.
Very sad news, gentlemen. We'll all keep Butch and Charlotte in our prayers. Jimmy will be back here. Doing that?
Her son's game warden.
Very sad. Guys, again, for the folks, a few folks in the audience, this baiting issue has been up here for a while. Obviously, I want to address two main issues on this that I think are flaws in the current law. While I do not support baiting, I've asked that we have an adult conversation in the room to address what I think is very, very serious issues to not only the hunters, but to the very the resource that we are pursuing. Okay. Representative Ridley, you obviously didn't get the note about adult conversation in the room with a bag of corn there. I won't hold you responsible because obviously your fellow representatives did not inform you of how, I guess, serious I am. I don't have to do this. I didn't have to hear this bill. But it being a deliberative body, I'm trying to address some flaws that I think are very serious issues to the hunters out there. And if we could come to a conversation, an adult conversation in a room again, then, you know, again, I don't have to do this. All right. So with that, I want to dial us back in real quick to what I think the two issues are. You'll start. There's two issues that I want us as a committee to focus on. One is the disease factor and the risk that is out there to Georgia's wildlife, especially in recent weeks as we're seeing CWD continue to spread. And the second issue has to do with what I'm saying is hunter rights. As many of you know, we passed a constitutional amendment in 2006 that protected the tradition of hunting and fishing, basically a hunter and fisherman's rights. It didn't just do it for one group of hunters over other, but I think the intent was to make sure that we had that tradition forever for all hunters, no matter what game you pursued. So with that, I want to, what is CWD? Let's make sure we're right on the page, okay? We talked about this a little bit the other day. It's a transferable, fatal neurological disease that affects the members of the deer family. It is always fatal. It's not bacterial or viral, but it's a misfolded protein. You can't kill it. It's not a living thing. And it's similar to mad cow disease in cattle, scrappy in sheep, and then Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. It's untreatable and 100% fatal. Okay? And the prions are virtually indestructible, lasting up to decades in certain environments. We've even heard and talked to folks that said they've even tried to incinerate it, and it still won't kill it. So this is a very serious issue, not only of CWD, but other forms of transmittable diseases. And I want to put right up front, baiting does not cause the disease, but it is the first thing that people look to stop it or curtail the spread of it. So it's the risk that is associated with it. Supplemental feeding and baiting causes unnatural concentration of deer, and reduction of contact through a ban on baiting and feeding is a very important step to preventing containing CWD outbreak. If y'all remember in 2000, I think it was 11, when we did the baiting bill, there were provisions put in there about shutting down baiting and supplemental feeding. If you look, CWD is transmittable through the direct animal contact and contact with the infected environment, saliva left behind at the bait sites. And when CWD is found in an individual deer, a buffer zone is established and all supplemental feeding and baiting is suspended. That's typically what happens. If you go to the Louisiana website, technology fails. Well, you think you get somebody from college, they would know what they were doing nowadays, wouldn't you? I would. I would. I can say it about him. 2 years, you think I'd get him trained. All right. Well, guys, those links and are to what has recently been taken out. There was a map. I thought we had that, but about the containment, and the first order of business was to ban all supplemental feeding and baiting. The deer was found in Mississippi, and not only did Mississippi contain the area, but across in the other state, Louisiana closed down 3 of its counties because it was within the buffer. So that's a serious issue that I think that we need to address. Next. Real quick before we get on to the next, that's where I want to let DNR come up, and I don't know if Wes is still here or John. But what I'd asked for the other day was for us as a committee to review, DNR to come in and to present what we have as a state with our current CWD response plan. I think it's imperative of us to make sure of what we've got here, that it's up to date, that it's accurate. So with that,
Chairman, for allowing us to be here today and to be engaged in this important issue. And this is an issue we definitely take seriously at DNR. And so we have today John Bowers, our Chief of Game Management, and also Colonel Eddie Henderson, who's the head of our law enforcement, to address some of these issues that you've mentioned here today. I do just want to start by saying that in terms of SB 450, the department is officially neutral on the bill. With that being said, we will be here to answer as many technical questions as you have and answer them as thoroughly as we possibly can. And so, again, we appreciate you taking this issue seriously and happy to be here for any questions. Thank you. Yep. A farmer in transportation? Hey, get rid of the public safety folks pulling everybody over. Get rid of the.
We actually haul it corn from North Georgia.
Watch your weight limits. Watch your weight limits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, I'm John Bowers, Chief of Game Management for the Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife Resources Division, and here to give you kind of a summary of what the department's chronic wasting disease response plan entails. The current plan is a couple years old. There's been a couple other states that have had outbreaks of CWD, most recently Mississippi. Additional knowledge and experience has come out, so that plan is under revision and to be updated, which is pretty much has to be done roughly about every 18 months to 24 months relative to what's going on with this disease. Once that plan is revised and updated, we'll be more than happy to provide a copy of it to the chairman and any members of this committee. With that said, just chronic wasting disease, and I think the chairman did have some of this on there. It is what's called a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. Sorry for the big words, folks. I don't make them up. Affecting members of the deer family, it is 100% fatal. There is no known vaccine, and there's no known treatment. It is caused by a prion. A prion is basically a protein change. So this thing's not living. If it's not living, it obviously can't be killed. Infected deer that have this protein or prion can shed this infectious agent through bodily fluids, infecting other deer and contaminating the environment where the prion can persist. Environmental persistence is unknown. In the event of detection, population impacts can be dramatically negative if the disease is left unmanaged. Our chronic wasting disease response plan lays out Georgia's strategy to determine the prevalence and the geographic extent of the disease and to minimize spread of the disease. This plan uses the latest scientific knowledge, techniques, and experience to guide our response. Our response plan is activated upon detection of a chronic wasting disease positive deer, which is known at that point will be known as the index case. Throughout our response action, there will be regular communications throughout pertinent levels of state and federal government among multiple agencies, regular media releases and press briefings, and public meetings in the affected area to inform interested citizens. Now to get to some of the particulars, if the index case is outside Georgia's borders, but within 5 miles of our border, our response is basically going to be an enhanced surveillance type response. We'll establish a 15-mile radius zone from that index case, establish check stations in that area to obtain samples from hunter harvested deer, collect and sample deer from private and public lands, collect and sample roadkill deer, and as provided by statute, we will prohibit feeding and baiting of wildlife within those respective counties. If the index case is within the state of Georgia, we will establish a 1-mile radius zone from the index case to intensively reduce deer density with a goal of depopulation and determine prevalence and geographic extent of the disease. This will include establishing check stations and mandatory testing of all deer, liberalizing deer seasons and bag limits, prohibiting infectious material and tissues from leaving the zone, and prohibiting feeding and baiting in all affected counties. In addition, there will be a 5-mile radius zone. All attempts in this zone will be made to moderately reduce deer density and enhance surveillance. This effort will include establishing everything that I mentioned previously, except we will attempt to test all hunter harvested deer and roadkills, working with private lands and landowners to collect and test deer from those lands as well as public lands. Again, prohibiting feeding and baiting in affected counties that are within the zone. And then there will also be an established 15-mile radius zone from the index case for increased surveillance and to reduce potential risks. Again, pretty much everything ago, except it's less mandatory approach to it. It's just more trying to get as many deer sampled and tested as we can. And again, prohibiting feeding and baiting in any affected counties. As data on prevalence and geographic extent changes, the zones are realigned contingent on the outermost index case. To just kind of help make sense. So if within the 5-mile zone we get a hot deer that's out near that 5-mile zone, that deer now becomes an index case 1-mile zone, another 5-mile zone, another 15-mile zone. So you can kind of see the more positives you get, the bigger this area grows. Experience suggests that the disease appears to form clusters around the index cases, and therefore intensive efforts to remove these clusters is critical in managing the disease. Management efforts in the outermost zones is also critical to reduce and minimize transition of the disease. That more or less, I think, summarizes the big high points that are involved in our response plan. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to entertain those at this time.
So what I know in our email back and forth, we said that we're behind as far as updating our CWD plan, especially in light of the Mississippi case. So where are we lacking? Where are we lacking in that plan? What are the areas in which our current plan does not address what it should be or what you're planning to?
Most of those issues I hit are things that are unlikely to change in this revision. Some of the other information is really based on the experiences of some of the states who've had it more recently, and kind of updating and reflecting that. This information, as I said, it changes every 18 to 24 months. We get new information and additional knowledge from states that are currently having to deal with this disease. And so this plan is updated about every 18 to 24 months. The last time that it was updated, if I remember correctly, was around October, November of 2015. And so it's been due. And I anticipate that it'll be this update, current revision and update will be completed within 2 months.
Okay. One of the things that we saw in Mississippi and with the Louisiana, and I don't see it in code, because I know in code that it allows for the commissioner, if CWD is found in Georgia, to then act. But again, I want to go back to our border states. So, more than likely, if we get this, it's going to either come from Alabama or probably the north of us, if I had to guess. What is the posture currently, or that you intend, as far as the border states, if it's found in the border states?
It
or
would
border counties, should I say, of the state?
that was that first step I went over. There, from that index case, a 15-mile radius will be drawn, and of course, most, depending on where it is, most of that radius could be, if it's say Alabama, could be in Alabama. Whatever part of that radius intersects Georgia and Georgia counties, that's where we'll start enhanced surveillance programs. In those counties, we will prohibit feeding and baiting. That'll be done through board rule. And we'll start, obviously, we'll be providing information as much as we can to the public and to folks in that potentially affected area.
So the current code that we have says the board may by rule and reg restrict feeding, baiting, or hunting deer upon or around such feed or bait in any county where there is a documented occurrence, and in any of the counties adjoining such county. Does that marry up with policy, or is the code only speaking within the Georgia boundaries?
I think that question needs to be answered by an attorney or legal counsel.
Okay. The other thing that we're starting to see is the cost, and obviously, with what we've done with, what was it, 208, Trey, what was it, 208? We've been trying to get the department new resources, obviously the hunters and the resources. What, and this, I don't know if this is a question for you or the deputy commissioner was in here a minute ago, but what it will be the anticipated cost, not if, but it's a matter of when this hits Georgia. I mean, it's the likelihood is when. What will it cost the department in terms of financial resources, man resources, and then what are we missing in terms of equipment, testing equipment, et cetera?
It would be very difficult to speculate on the cost because those things are changing. Depends on the intensity of what you're dealing with and the information that you obtain from that changes what you do and how you react. I am aware that Wisconsin, they're still dealing with it, but when the first year that they were dealing with chronic wasting disease, it cost $18 million. Currently, in order to cover this cost, if it occurred here, would have to be borne by the agency, and in order to make those costs meet, would require the agency to reallocate funding from other programs to support this effort.
I noticed, like Alabama, although it has not hit Alabama, now that Mississippi is there, I noticed that their respective commissioner of natural resources, along with their, I guess, ag commissioner, that they have purchased the equipment for testing. And again, that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to get at, is weighing the risk of what we're doing with the cost of increasing the risk. Are those items that have been talked about, thought through? Would we do likewise? My second question is once you're within that zone in the hunting, there are different I guess reports out, studies, but obviously it is recommended by the state health departments that you test your deer prior to eating the CWD, a potential a deer that has CWD. How would we get that out? How would that affect, if you will, deer processors, individuals? What have you seen in other states?
The result, I guess, at least information has been provided by other states is somewhat kind of ambiguous. Some places have seen some significant impacts. They did level out, and then others have seen little impact. Relative to the state of Georgia, I'm not going to speculate on what that may or may not do to deer processors or individuals. As far as consumption of that meat, that will be up to each individual to determine for theirself. However, we will be setting up check stations in these zones, and having people bring their deer there so we can take samples. And of course, with some of the public information that we would provide, our recommendation is that have your deer tested and wait until you get the results back.
One last question for me, and then we'll take some questions from the committee members. With CWD having historically, I mean, we've got historical data of other states that have done this. What is the impact on hunters, depending on, I guess, the size or the intensity of the outbreak? In other words, one of the things that we do and that we've tried to do, and certainly this committee has been engaged with as well as the department and the commissioner, is hunter retention, new hunters. So from a perspective of that, is there data from other states that will give us a gauge as to what that does to hunter numbers, either dropping off, staying the same, license sales, that? And that may not be a question for you. That may be a question for, deputy commissioner or commissioner, from there regarding license sales.
I don't know that I can answer that
Okay.
question.
That may be a question from the department. All right, with that, we'll just, Steve, I'll hit you next.
Yes, sir. Just the 1 mile elimination zone. Does it then become treated as the 5 mile, or does it continue to be a elimination zone for a period of time? Or it'd probably just become part of the 5 mile, wouldn't it?
It'll continue to be treated that way, but of course, remember, once we do detect one, we're probably going to be we are very likely to be dealing with a situation where it's already been present for some time,
Mhm.
and we're very likely,
Elimination zone.
based
would
on
grow.
what's happening in other states, that you're going to find another one, and those zones are going to be amorphous.
Yeah, I got you. Okay.
And they will continue to be CWD management zones. At this point, based on our knowledge and experience out there, in perpetuity.
So it moved with that elimination zone. Thank you.
Going down the line, Trey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I applaud y'all for having these plans ready. Would you agree this is an anomaly, sort of like the bird flu? I know Commissioner Black has the plan for the last few years. We've had a scare with that, and they've come up with a catastrophic plan to contain that. And that, would you say this is on the same type playing field as that?
No, I wouldn't. Based on experiences in other states, there's no state that's been able to eradicate it,
Okay. All right.
and it's been a challenge to contain it.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Just reading the screen up there, it also says supplemental feeding and baiting causes unnatural concentration of deer. Does that mean I'm going to have to go in and kill my food plots?
No.
Okay. All right. Because it's nothing for me to ride into my little 10-acre bottom that I got planted and see 25, 30 deer sitting there at one time. Okay. All right. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I wanted to say first that I think everybody would agree that we need to be ready for what if. We can have a lot of conversations, but if you woke up one day and there was a detected case, deer hunters would be the ones worried. It wouldn't be the non-deer hunters. So anyway, I appreciate y'all having that and prepared. My question would be, the chairman mentioned bordering states. What is the nearest confirmed, documented CWD that we know of from Georgia? What's the closest documented case of CWD?
I have to say one in Mississippi. I know there's some in Illinois, but
And
I
that was
think
right there
Mississippi's
where
closer.
the Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi border touched, right on that T right there, if I'm not mistaken, the way it showed it on the map.
Northwestern Mississippi.
Okay, that was it. Thank you.
And who's next? Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John, I know you remember a few years ago, we've had some legislation introduced here that would allow, we already have a high fence rule with a minimum number of acres, but we don't allow the importation of breeder bucks or any kind of does. And I've been in those meetings with weir biologists, and we've had some heated discussions about that. Obviously, there's a lot of our neighboring states that do that, and it's a big draw. I mean, I've hunted high fences, but in my opinion, and I'm just asking you of your opinion on this, but I think everybody in the room understands that baiting doesn't cause CWD. But if we were to allow importing of these breeder bucks or any type of does or even artificial insemination, that is one surefire way that you can bring that disease in. Is that correct? If you brought in an infected animal.
I would agree with your assessment and would also like to take the opportunity to thank this body for several years ago for passing that law that prohibited those activities and for holding that line, because that right there, in my opinion, my professional opinion, has been number one highest risk for this disease.
So do you think that some of these states where they've had the outbreaks, is there a pattern that these are states where they allow that practice?
There's evidence of free-ranging deer in some states and captive bred or captive facility deer in other states, and evidence of both in some states. I know it's a little confusing, bear with me. But a preponderance of the evidence suggests that the most likelihood means of getting this disease is through that captive industry.
Mm-hmm.
Which is very high risk.
Very high risk.
That's why this body did what it did, is it assessed the risk of what it was doing against the consequences. Speaking of talking about the fastest way to get it here, like Chairman Shaw said, is importing it, and that be through a live deer or even through carcasses. I know that part of the response from Louisiana and Mississippi that I've read about, and I think Alabama's doing something, is talking about deboning, bringing carcasses in. I know a lot of us may hunt in border states. What does Georgia currently do, and if that's inadequate, what would Georgia do in regards to protecting against somebody going to a state that has CWD and bringing that back through a carcass, if you will?
A few years ago, when this body addressed the live importation, within the language or sections within that law also addressed carcass importation, so that if you, and it is broad enough language that we don't have to go back and revisit it every time a new state pops up on the radar. It just basically, if you are hunting in a state with a known CWD case, you are not allowed to bring that carcass back into Georgia. It has to be boned out meat, clean skull, and it goes through and lists all those, and as a protective measure to address exactly what the scenario that you just provided. Again, those are what the statute says, and hunter compliance can't be exaggerated.
Yeah.
As well as enforcement of those statutes.
All right.
One
And
further question, Mr. Chairman.
go ahead.
I didn't say anything on the first meeting the other day, but if you allow, I just wanted to go back to the question at point in the bill dealing with baiting. I sponsored House Bill 277 in 2011, so we've had these arguments within our hunting family, and for the chairman and I, even within our
Family.
that we all both married into. But I just want to tell the committee that I've only had one complaint. I mean, in my district, I'd say that it was 99% of the hunters favored what we did, and we gave them what they wanted, and they're still thankful for it. But I've only had one complaint in those 7 or 8 years since then, and that was from a friend who it's the question that you brought up about a neighbor feeding close to the line, and it caused them hard feelings, and it was a small track next to a big track, but that's something I don't know if you can fix. I mean, that's just that's like trying to tell neighbors to get along, when they just can't get along.
When the pecans fall on the wrong side.
Right.
Well,
But anyway, I think that I think
that may be a segue into the second part
Okay.
of what we're going to
All right, thank you.
discuss. Go back. Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Quick, testing. If you're gonna test an animal, brain the first place, or if you could take a carcass, what would you test? First thing you'd test.
Okay, that actually is a great question. One of the things I forgot to mention, just want to let this body know too, we've been testing. We've been testing in earnest since 2002. Prior to 2002, we had a few tests here and there. These would be animals that somebody called into us that were acting abnormal or sick. We would go and we'd provide them to SCWDS, Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study, to do a necropsy, determine cause of death, and during that we would ask them to make sure they pulled the tissue necessary to test for chronic wasting disease. Those weren't a lot of samples, but that goes back to about 97, 98. But in 2001 to present, we've been testing in earnest. And over that time period, we have tested more than 6,000 deer. And we don't have what are called negative tests. The test is just that it wasn't detected. So you either have a not detected result or a positive result. And the tissue that we obtain is what's called the obex. It's lower part, basically part of the brain stem. So we take what are called the retro lymph nodes out of the throat, retropharyngeal lymph nodes. We take both those tissues, and a portion of those tissues are sent to the lab to be tested. The other part is retained, because if you do get a positive, you send another sample to another lab to have that confirmed. Basically want a double confirmation.
But like bone marrow and all that would carry it. It would carry the
all nervous tissue and bodily fluids. The prion can be found in those tissues.
If it were to come to an outbreak, and obviously the health departments have weighed in clearly across the states, suggesting that you test a deer that may be in an area of CWD infection, what is the individual cost that it would do, and how would that be paid for? Or how is it being paid for in other states, if you know that?
Yeah. Well, I think right now we're paying about $18 to $20 a sample, if I remember correctly, to have our test done. If in one of these zones, like the 1 mile zone, it'll be a mandatory testing of all deer. So we'll have check stations set up. Individual will bring their deer there. We'll pull the sample. We'll take care of testing it. Outside of that, our strong recommendation would be that folks have that tissue tested. We could certainly offer technical assistance in doing it, but I do not know, because you cannot assess the volume there, and I don't know that our budget could withstand.
Chairman Pruitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question. I missed the first part of your presentation, but you were talking about it would be passed through bodily fluids. If you had a pile of bait and they're eating from that source and saliva and things like that, if hogs or anything like that, even wild hogs, got into that bait, could it be transferred?
At this time, there's no evidence to indicate that it can.
Thank you.
Transfer to the hogs, or the hogs transfer it somewhere else?
I interpreted the question to be transmitted from a deer to a hog. Was that?
Yeah, I was thinking
Okay.
if the hog came in and ate the same feed and saliva and things were there from an infected deer, could it be passed on to other animals?
At this time, there's no evidence to indicate that. For hogs, it could be picked up by other deer.
Any other questions? If you will, though, can you, as I requested, a current copy of the CWD plan, and then as you update the plan, send that to us also, if you would.
So the current,
Yeah,
what we have now, okay.
where we stand and then where
All
we're
right.
going.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, this plan, I mean, while we're, I guess, the steward of the plan, and we're a main component of it, we did involve in input and work closely with our Georgia Department of Ag in preparing this plan. If we do have a response, they will be involved with us, as well as Georgia Department of Health.
So real quick, as you update this, I take by your comment that the Georgia Department of Agriculture is a partner in this response or in the plan or in the making of a plan.
In helping us put the plan together, and they will be a partner in our response.
Okay. All right. What number?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the questions that just come to my mind as you were closing, I apologize. Are there known cases of CWD in states that do not allow baiting or pouring out corn of any kind?
I'll have to go back and assess that information. Can I get that answer to you in a couple days?
I think it was a good question for the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. With that, thank you, John. I appreciate that. I think that starts a discussion of, the risk. It shows the seriousness of where we're at. Probably also in light of Mississippi, that we're maybe a few months behind in updating this. But I wanted to make sure that the committee knows how serious this is, how costly this is. Because again, just like in the legislation banning the importation of deer, there was a risk-reward situation. You can't say that importing deer is going to cause CWD or they all have it, but it's a great risk of it. And I think that's, again, it's the purpose of us talking about this, because ultimately what we're trying to do is protect the resource, the whitetail herd that we have in Georgia, because that's the last thing we need to have anything happen to. Okay? Yeah.
Is there disease before visual evidence of disease, or we know that? In other words, they could have this before they start wasting.
That's correct.
Okay, so is there a test, just for future reference, is there a test for people who ship semen and other than being fatal to the donor?
That's an excellent question. There is no reliable live test.
Yeah. All right. With that, John, thank you. I appreciate that. The next part of, I think, what I want the committee to start, again, looking at, and this is a very serious issue. It was part of the original 2011 debate. And Colonel, you're on the hot. Colonel, I think this is your part. Again, is making sure that we are protecting all hunters and their lawful pursuit of game, that we're not putting one in jeopardy or of another, or at the expense of another hunter. So with that, if you will, it's the big question in the state of Georgia: are hunters who choose not to bait protected from those that do bait? I want to clarify that question, or that what's on there. I should have more detail. I don't really think from deer to deer, if you're a deer hunter, you there's much chance of that. Okay, but I think the question should have read: are hunters other than deer or hogs who are they protected from those who are hunting the species of deer and hogs, which it is legal to hunt bait over? That's been the question. That was part of the discussion in 2011, the original bill, specifically around landowners, and jeopardizing neighboring hunters. Next slide, please. And I think that goes to the issue, and I'll let the confusion that's out there. I know in the pack, your packet, you know, again, we talked about the survey from GON. That was used as far as the hunter, survey as far as being favorable or not favorable condition. But this same survey that came out, and this was less than a year ago, about a year ago, and I don't know how many pages. It's 31 pages worth of yeah. It was in late 15, going into 12 of 15, December of 15. But again, it shows, I think, there is confusion with the law, and that's what, Colonel, I'd like for you to, that's the discussion I want to have. And first of all, I want to reiterate what we talked about the other day, going back to to 2011. I understand, and believe me, to the committee, the judgment that we've got within our commissioner and with this colonel of DNR is common sense. Okay? I went to the Dove, Dove training. I know what this colonel's, what's in his mind, and I know what he is his opinion. So this is not about you, Colonel, or the leadership that is coming down with the direction. In fact, if I could have you for the next 50 or 100 years, there may not be a question of this concern, because it's the judgment that I think that your leadership and that's going down that is setting a common sense tone that it's there. But unfortunately, who knows where any of us are going to be next year, or 5 years down the road, or 10 years down the road. And what we in this General Assembly do is try to write law that makes it very clear, not only for the law enforcement officers who have to enforce the law, but also for the citizens who have to follow the law to make sure it is as clear as possible. And that's where I think we need to focus on what's here. It's clear there's some confusion out there. I mean, it's in public debate. But Colonel, start us off with what you've seen, directions from the department and all that.
Well, as far as that goes, not familiar with probably the blog you're talking about to know specifically what the confusion points are. But as a general rule, when it comes to baiting, we have what you set in the General Assembly here, the legislative body. We have the laws that are set there. And then ultimately we get case law that's based off of that from the judicial process. And that guides us how we enforce the law. And to a certain degree, that to me is what we try to do, is have that common sense approach. With any law in the state of Georgia, you've got to show intent of the individual. So that's where our kind of common sense piece comes in, is to being able to say what that's not reading someone's mind, but we have to show that person had intent to violate that law. And that's general intent. There's two types of intent in the state of Georgia, general and specific. That's within Title 16. Our laws fall under the general intent, that person should have known generally for some reason, if they're standing knee deep in bait, whatever it may be, and it's illegal to do so. We look for the flagrant type violations currently. Probably with the baiting South Georgia, to my knowledge, there's been no significant issues or concerns on our part. We just enforce what you establish here, and we work through that process. We have a policy manual that's about this thick with guidance to our officers when circumstances come up, situations come up, that we need to give our guidance on how that's handled. One good example, our policy for baiting was 200 yards and out of line of sight prior to 2011. That got codified. So our practice we were already using got put into statute. That's current statute today. Kind of mirrors what we were doing that's already being codified. As you know, I guess the feeding process is still allowed in North Georgia now. This would make a change as far as where the hunter actually can sit in location to that, I guess, is the easiest way to stipulate that. And I don't know if I'm really answering your question, Mr. Chairman.
This is what I want us to, again, this is make sure we're serious about this. the question when you come down to intent is you're exercising judgment.
Correct.
Okay? And there's always going to be, there is out there, even though the larger number of deer hunters than there are other hunters, we still have on the books, if we look at it, that you can't bait, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I don't think I am, I'm trying to read this, but you can only hunt deer and hogs in Georgia over bait in the southern zone as it currently stands,
That's
right?
correct, yes, sir.
On the flip side, it is illegal to hunt anything other than deer and hogs over bait in Georgia.
That's correct. The feed can still be out as long as you're 200 yards and, out of line of sight for any other species too.
Is any other species?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So, the feeding takes place like probably some clubs feed all year, maybe turkey or whatever. But that, we work through all that. I think what you're asking, we work through that on a regular basis, like turkey season, whatever it may be out there. Some clubs feed, they may not turkey hunt, but they have to be cognizant of that. And if our officers come across that, then they have to work through that just with that common sense, and that intent is backed up by the court system for us. That holds our feet to the fire with that piece of it.
But I'm trying to go back to code.
Yes, sir.
And again, that's what this discussion is about, is trying to mirror what you're enforcing right now versus what the code section is. The only place that in the past that I've seen is the allowing specifically to hunt deer outside of 200 yards. In other words, when I look at the other part of the code in regards to what is defined baiting, it does not have a distance to it.
All right.
Am I wrong on that?
We have our own opinion, OIR as we call it, opinion, interpretation, and ruling guidance for our officers that stipulates the 200 yards and out of line of sight. And I believe that's in our hunting regs too, isn't it? For all species, that it's laid out for the hunters to know that information.
Okay, but again, I'm going back to code.
Right.
What I see in code is in the northern zone currently, it's only deer that you got to be 200 yards away and out of the line of sight of bait. Southern zone, you can shoot them with their head in the bucket, so to speak.
Correct.
But on the other animals that are out there, if I'm reading the code says that baiting is defined as putting all these things out so as to constitute a lure or attraction or enticement for any game bird, game animal other than deer and hogs.
Correct. That's correct.
So I don't see in our code where it is defining. In other words, I've understood from looking at case law, but and again, federal too, we'll get into that. But it's circumstantial based on the circumstances of the case. So again, I'm not in code. It doesn't say that. It may be the judgment and what's being exercised from within the department, but code doesn't say that.
Code does not specifically say that. You're correct. That is our practice, our guidance to our officers to give them a general. We're just mirroring what the deer law is.
But again, this is a serious point I want to make to the committee. We're not going to be sitting here, all of us, 5 years, 10 years down the road. Colonel's not going to be sitting here exercising what I think is common sense judgment, okay? I don't know who's going to be here.
Sure.
There are other states where they used to have hunters like we've got who are enforcing it, and now they have people who are anti-hunters in those positions. So how are they going to interpret the laws? Okay, you're doing one way, which I think the state and this General Assembly finds very pleasing. Okay, I find comforting personally that I've got common sense people, but this is my question down the road: is can somebody take what you've interpreted and interpret it a different way? And that's been my point the whole time with this argument.
They can, There's no argument with that. But typically, the courts are what kind of give us our guidance for our common sense piece. And that's everything from the Georgia Court of Appeals, U.S., or even our officers even have to operate under what the local judicial system will accept, if you know what I mean. You know, there's variation from one county to another with what a probate judge will accept, and our officers have to work through all that to have a general knowledge of that. You know, we can only enforce as much law as the public will allow us. That's true with any kind of law enforcement, and that usually is resonated through you sitting here
Yeah.
and what you're hearing from the public, and gives us those parameters we work within.
Well, that's the common sense.
Yes,
Colonel,
sir.
That's there, but I'm trying to get at the non-common sense, and I think there are also some inconsistencies that I think could be cleared up with what is here, so that the common person who reads this will be able to understand. Next slide. And I guess this is where I'm looking at, and again, it's common sense, but the point about being confusing is in the 2018. I don't know if is it in the packs or is it? Okay, but in the 2018 DNR rules and regs, or is 1718. We've got a problem with feral hogs, or up on there it says feral hogs may be hunted over or near bait on private lands year-round in every county, provided the bait is not within 50 yards of any property ownership boundary. Placing bait for hogs may make a property or a portion of the property unhuntable for other species, such as turkeys. Hunters are urged to communicate with others who may hunt other species on or near an area where bait for deer or hogs is being considered. Again, I think even with our own regs, we're telling you there's no set, but that's in the 2017
Sure.
18 regs. In addition, I guess, how do we look at we obviously, and I'm trying to go back, but what's we got a 50 yards in one case and
Right.
line in another.
And 27-324 established that 50 yards when it was passed to legalize the baiting for hogs, and I think that preceded the deer bait, so that's probably where that discrepancy came in. So that is codified. 27-324, I believe, is the code section for hogs, and it does have that 50-yard limitation from the property line, and that's not under 2739B.
Yeah. But my question is, how, as an officer out there, how are we doing this? The loopholes that are there, and how do you walk up and tell if we're baiting, not baiting? I'm shooting
That's through
hogs or
through investigative techniques of the officer. They have to work through all of that. They have to work through all those. And for example, with feral hogs, officers will only respond to these situations through complaints. Property lines must be clearly marked, so you got to know where that's at. Any enforcement action taken by that officer should be the most moderate action necessary to gain voluntary compliance. Ultimately, that's what we all want: voluntary compliances with our laws, and that's just a quote out of our current policy that we have.
Well, the next point is regarding the Senate and the amendment and how that got about. If you do go back and look at the history, the bill that passed out of the House had the 50-yard line or the 50-yard boundary for deer and hogs on it.
The original one?
The original one that passed
Okay.
out. But what happened in the Senate, they didn't want any boundaries whatsoever to take care of this. So, but in a haste, they amended the deer part, but not the hog part. So that is why there are some inconsistencies and confusion here with what happened. But that's the history of the bill. And again, I'm just trying to say we've got inconsistencies in here. Why are we able to do hogs versus deer? Are they treated differently? The other thing that I want to talk about is, and it gets to the part regarding if you bait, okay. Let me see here. Let me go back to the bill as it is now. Yeah. And my interpretation of this may be different than council, but in the code where it talks about under A2, it's prohibiting a person from exposing or distributing, bait so as to constitute a lure or enticement for deer, okay, on lands that are not under, you can't do it on state or federal land, provided, however, that such lure, attraction, or enticement shall not cause hunting on the adjoining property to be prohibited under Section
Right.
B. I've wrestled with it, and again, council may say otherwise than you, but how do you interpret that?
Our
Is that-
interpretation of that is that's a protection for that adjoining landowner. That means they can't be held responsible for that bait that's over there on that adjoining property.
Okay.
And that sort of goes back to intent again. What's the intent of that individual?
Well, and again, I'm sitting here trying to wrestle with the other part of the code that says you can't hunt turkeys and everything else.
Right.
And I guess illustration or the next, what's the next? The next slide? Here's my scenario, and I guess property owner, you got property, you got the turkey roost, and you got a feeder behind it, and 110 yards away. That's baiting, isn't it? I mean, if a hunter sets up between a turkey roost and the feeder,
That could be construed as hunting over bait. Yes,
Okay.
it could be.
could be.
You have to go to the intent of that individual and that officer going through a process to figure out what that individual's intent. If that's all open and no trees or nothing there, yes, sir, that would be considered hunting over bait.
Hardwood bottom coming out to a field.
Yes, sir, that could be considered hunting over bait.
Okay.
There's no absolutes with all of this, to be honest with you.
I know, and that's the uncertainty
Yes,
that
sir.
is out there.
Yes, sir.
Okay. But if that's the case, then how is that different than the next one? Same scenario, except we put a property line in there. Same exact scenario.
Goes back to knowledge and intent.
Okay.
And that's what our officers have to look at. Did that individual have knowledge of the bait, and was their intent to take that turkey over bait going to that feed?
And
That's an investigative piece that our officers have to work through. I mean, they do that today.
Okay. But here comes into where I've been trying to make a point since 11. That's my land. I'm property A. Or I'm not going to use me. I'm going to use Emory. Okay. And John's over there, and he's property owner B. Well, but guys, this is serious. I'm serious. This is the heart of what we need to be looking at for the future. And hold on a second. Let me get through my scenario, okay? Emory sees that feeder. He knows that feeder's there. What is he now?
If he has knowledge
Mhm.
and he has intent to kill that bird over bait, then he's in violation, if that answers your question. But that's the key points there.
But that's where I'm trying to get this committee to take this from. At this point, Emory is an honest guy. We all know that. We've dealt with him. He's a great guy. But he calls you up and he says, "What do I do in this situation? What is the remedy?"
Well, the remedy is what we do now today. Our officer goes out there, looks at that scenario, meets with that landowner, meets with that hunter, and talks through what they need to do to fix the problem if there's a problem.
Okay.
That's today's,
I-
the way we do it currently.
But the point is now in the meantime, because the law says 10 days after the bait is removed, Emory is out of luck.
That's a good
can't
possibility, yes.
Hunt. That's we're getting back into the property rights, into the issue. Hold on a second. I'm gonna recognize you. This is a serious conversation. I'm not gonna look over anybody, okay? But that's that's turkey season coming up. The other thing though is and this is where I wanna make sure we're also protecting our resources, right? I mean,
That's
the
our
object is to
important
make sure
piece,
that
yes.
we're protecting the turkeys. But let's say that John and Emery, and this is a difficulty that's on law enforcement now, but let's say John and Emery are really neighbors. They're good friends, but John's Mr. Whitetail, and Emery says, put that feeder up there. Then you've got the collusion part. And if there's a hedgerow or whatever, now your officers are going to be in a situation where they're going to have to investigate, but because the law is there, it may be what I call a hole, a loophole in the law. But let's take this scenario, and I didn't do another drawing. My drawing skills are bad, but I want to go to the federal part. That's also in a scenario like this, but you could expand it greatly because now we've got dove, duck, all the other federal migratory birds that are out there, and there's several on the list, right?
Yes, sir.
What do we do? Obviously, the judgment of our Georgia DNR and your judgment, again, I'm not worried about it. But under federal code, the leniency and the judgment there of the department won't hold up, will it?
Well, just to give you a little background, it's a good question. Typically, like with our dove baiting, we have to work through, and you've been to our training. We
Good training, guys. By the way, if you've never been, you ought to go.
Do you have to do training if you get caught hunting over bait? Is that one?
That's kind of on-the-job training, isn't
Yeah.
it?
He has a good dove shooter.
Okay.
No, seriously, if you did that, that was a good exercise. I appreciate what you did, Colonel.
We continually, because of case law, maybe incidents that occur, we continually update our policies, practices, and procedures. We recently, within the last few years, updated our hunting doves over bait because of a case law we learned about Traxler versus State. When we made some significant changes to that policy, I got with the special agent in charge here in Atlanta with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to review our policy, our practices, and procedures to ensure there was no conflict with the way we do business and the way they do business. Yes, there's different ways of looking at things, but overall, the case law they're getting now is more similar to the way we're doing business. And you're probably thinking about maybe years ago, zone of influence that they would operate under. Somebody may be 2 properties away hunting doves, but the doves are going to bait on 2 properties over. They can't do that anymore. There's case law that prohibits that. They've also got to show knowledge and intent. And that's even within the last year they've had case law that sets that. I can't remember the case right off. But to answer your question, I think we're more similar now than we have ever been between the feds and the way we do business.
But while similar, again, I haven't seen the case law. I've just tried to read what was there. In fact, if you go to, I handed it the other day, online, it says be careful because of the supplemental feeding. You could be in jeopardy for
Sure.
federal purposes where under state law, you're not. I mean, that was on the federal
On probably their
website.
regulations,
Yes. And it said problem. I mean, it was very much highlighted. Again, I'm going back to the situation, and this is what I'm trying to get to the committee. We can exercise a lot of judgment, but in the end, there's going to be conflict. There is conflict here. The turkey situation is a conflict. I think that the waterfowl is more because certainly the baiting or what is constitutional baiting under the federal code is very strict, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, so it may not be this. You can't even manipulate, anything that's even grown there and leave it. It's got to be normal agricultural practices. So I think there is a higher standard, right?
Our law and theirs is basically the same when it comes to that. The only difference, I think there's a provision like under food plots and stuff like that that's a little bit different under the federal law. But like with, dove fields, you can mow it, you can manipulate it.
Don't grow it there, but don't take it off.
Yes, sir. And with us, you can't take it off and bring it back on.
But so you're telling me that there's no more strict liability at the federal level?
No, there may be some interpretations on how they enforce the baiting versus us, but now we're a lot more similar now than what we used to be.
Well, I'd like to see that code because, again, my understanding of reading the code and what case laws that I've found. In
I'll
fact,
get you, I'll find the copy of that the latest case law that
Okay.
it's within the last year.
But, you know, there are case laws where neighbors, you know, they're on notification, and at that point, you're done.
Right.
Okay?
And plus with the bait, you know, like with dove baits, as you know, if our officers become aware of that, gain knowledge of it, we have to post that field to warn the public that field's baited, if we find it prior to them hunting
Okay.
it.
But,
And the
We had
feds
a
do
pro-
not have to do that.
okay.
That is one difference.
Yeah. But again, maybe we're getting at to the point where there's 2 points. There's somebody not putting somebody in jeopardy that otherwise, you know,
Sure.
okay? But the other part is when I go back to a land rights, you know, a ownership right, and my right to do something legally, just like we got to with Emory in the example there. What do we do up under, at that point? Emory's out. And that may be something that this committee needs to think about is a notice issue. Okay? I talk about mitigation and things of that nature. Everybody knows, I mean, I do a big bird shoot every year as a fundraiser. Call the colonel in, and they check the fields. I don't want to be in any trouble there. But what if somebody 100 yards away on the other side is preparing for bow season and puts up a corn feeder? What is my position at that point? And I see it, or whether I see it or not, and you show up that day.
Like for dove hunting versus deer, you know, that's depends on the scenario. Our officer, what they would have to look through, goes back to those 2 key things: knowledge and intent. That officer has to work through to decide what's the intent on that dove field. What's your intent? Are you trying to shoot doves coming over
once
that?
you show up and see it, or once I have constructive notice of it, where does it put the person who is not baiting, who has lawful intent to pursue game? Where does it put them?
The scenario you're laying out without actually physically looking at it, I can't give you an answer to that without having the scenario.
Well, I mean, scenario, I mean, very similar to that. Dove
Most-
field on the other side of the hedgerow,
Most-
visible, 75 yards, somebody put out a feeder, they're getting ready for bow season, and they're starting to feed.
Most likely, the scenario you're laying out with some way of not to visibly see that, and maybe even if you did, I don't know, that would not really be construed as bait. What's the intent of that? And one thing on our dove fields, it's a little bit different with our enforcement there. We also try to, you know, just say for example, a pay shoot somewhere. The landowner there is wanting to have a good shoot. He goes out and sweetens it up a little bit, puts a little extra feed out there. Our goal is not to punish that guy that paid $50 to go shoot. We try to get down that.
The two
that
parts of the
person-
code, the
that
person
person-
responsible for it, right?
Yes, sir.
And then the person taking advantage of it.
And that's our practice, is to try to work toward that person responsible for putting that person in such a position to be hunting over bait. We realize there's folks that come from Atlanta, Georgia, may not have ever been on an agricultural field in their life, would not know that cracked corn is actually bait. So we try to work through all that by working toward that on doves. That's a little bit
Yeah.
different with doves.
I know, and again, a little stricter. I mean, the feds, it's, but my point is, you see it, or you show up and you point it out. David, we just saw this. I don't know if you know it. Hunt's over, or at least until the bait is removed. Or I show up that morning or 2 days before the hunt, and I'm going, oh my word, you know, I've got 60 guys coming in to hunt a dove field, and my neighbor put this up. Where does that leave?
I'll tell you what, most likely where it would put you, and again, it depends on the terrain, scenario, and everything else. We have had similar things to that where our officer goes in and says, and draws a line for them. From this point over, y'all can hunt. You can't this, to help mitigate some of those. It may not be true. If it's a 10-acre field, that may not be possible. But if we're talking bigger areas, I mean, we work through things like that on a semi-regular basis.
But again, we're exercising judgment. and
That's
that- and-
correct.
But again, my point being, it's clear, there's 75 yards, we're shooting a 20-acre field, it's 75 yards on the other side of the hedge road. It's spinning corn. I think it gets back to my point. There's a gap in here where somebody can do something legally, try to exercise judgment, but even if you do, at some point where the person who is legally doing something, trying to legally do it, has notice or intent, but let's put it this way, they have notice at this point. At that point, doesn't the 10-day rule kick in, and you've got to go, and in the case of doves, if you look under that section, the code says that you can then go find the landowner or the person responsible and have them remove the bait, and if they don't, it's I think it's a misdemeanor or whatever.
We can't require them to remove the bait, but they do have to remove it and wait 10 days prior to hunting it if they want to hunt it. We go find the landowner and they're supposed to post the property. That may be what you're thinking of, sir. But as a general rule, our officers just go ahead and post that property if it's a baited dove field.
Yeah, but it says right here, if the conservation ranger cannot it says a sufficient number of signs shall be erected to put notice to hunters that the field or the area,
Yes,
that
sir.
doesn't mean a property line, okay, is baited for doves. If the ranger cannot locate the owner or person having lawful possession or control of the baited area, it shall be to put up the signs, to put
Right.
notice. We don't want to put anybody in jeopardy, right?
That's right.
Okay? The owner or the other person having lawful possession or control of an area or field baited for doves who fails to comply with an order of a ranger requiring removal of bait or the erection of the sign.
Right.
So you do have the power to have somebody who is to remove the bait, right?
We have never done that. I'll be honest with you.
yeah, but-
And the law may stipulate that, but there's no way I can go tell a guy, you gotta remove that bait. He can just feed it, as long as he never hunts on it, he can leave the feed there.
Yeah, but the scenario is that, go back to the slide, whether it's turkey or whether it's the dove, I call you up. Didn't we say in the turkey that now he has got to wait 10 days till it's up?
Possibly, yes, sir.
All right.
Could be.
Again, my provision is when does that 10 days start? Is there
When the bait's removed.
but when the bait removed, but under the code, under the section of the dove section, you can require the removal of that bait, right?
The key is whether or not they hunt it. It's not bait until they hunt it. Now, on doves, we can put notice out
No,
that there's feed there.
Hold a second, Colonel. Let's switch from the dove, switch back to our scenario right there.
Back to deer now?
Turkey,
Turkey, okay?
okay? Emery's the hunter. He knows that the feeder's there. It's his neighbor, it's John. John's all things deer and supplementing deer, okay? And he knows it and he sees it, okay? He calls you, just like the scenario, he says, what am I in? And you said, you got notice, you can't hunt it. My point is now what do we do at that point? Under the code, under the dove section, it appears to have language where you can get to the owner or the person responsible and tell them to remove it. He's still out the ability to hunt, right?
Yes. If
Same
it's
scenario
considered bait,
here.
yes.
Do you have under the code for small game or any other game outside of dove to get to the landowner and say, you have now put your adjacent landowner or you stopped his hunting. I didn't put him in jeopardy. You have actually stopped him from use of his property. Can you move it? That's where I'm going with this, guys. This is not unreal. And I'll tell you why the point I'm making. Southern Zone has bigger land lot, bigger farms and stuff. Not to say they don't have, but when we extend this, or if it ever gets extended to North Georgia, this scenario is going to be a lot more likely because they're smaller. The land is smaller. We don't have as many 1,000-acre tracts of land in the northern part of the state as perhaps we do in the southern part of the state. I know in that western part where you are, there's still probably some large tracts. But you're going to be bumping up against this scenario more and more than what we think. So, again, that's where I'm trying to get everybody to think. If you're going to do this, is there something in the code that you need to put somebody on notice? Give the department, LE, the ability to go out and say, I'm not being able to pursue this. I need you to step in. I need to put a fellow landowner on notice that I'm in jeopardy of baiting, okay? And I can't pursue a game animal or a bird because of your action. Does that make sense, committee?
You may wanna put your distance limitation you had in there before, something to see if that would help with your concern.
Feeder within 200 feet of their line.
Yeah,
I don't think the feeder would be what you need to move, because I don't think anybody in the right mind's gonna put the feeder on the property.
there?
Everybody wants to put the feeder in the middle and draw the stuff to the middle.
Well, hold on a second, guys. Y'all,
But like if you
we're
put
not
the
talking
line-
about, we're talking about the law, and we're talking about what it is.
Right.
Because part of the argument, okay, for those that weren't here, you know, you've got all kind of different land shapes, sizes. You may have somebody that's got 50 acres, but that 50 acres is in an L shape and it's very long and narrow. And it bore.
I've got to go. Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Be quick.
Yes. And
No, I
then we'll-
mean,
we'll
I
start
know this is passionate to everybody, and I feel you're passionate about it. We got 7 years of case law and enforcement law in South Georgia. Has it been a problem? Has
no,
any-
sir.
Okay.
Has there ever been a case?
Well, no, I'm telling you, but it's
Anything bait related down there?
the most thing that bothers me is the scenario that if it limited some other type hunter from doing hunting, that's what I want to know if it's been a problem.
That has not been a problem.
I hope we have another meeting because and I hear a word you're saying, and but you know, and I know we got these scenarios, and I know that scenario ain't gonna happen, but it could happen. They wouldn't. Who's gonna put a feeder there where they can? But I understand it. I understand what you're saying. I thank y'all for your presentation.
Well, I'll tell you, it did happen. We didn't shoot a dove field. It's now a diaper plant, but there used to be a ditch. We planted sunflowers. And on the other side of the ditch, the guys that had rented it came in and mowed and spread wheat. It was clearly visible. Okay? And we didn't shoot the field. So don't tell me, and don't sit here and say that it hasn't happened or it didn't happen. That is not addressing the issue, okay? It happened.
Would you address that scenario that he just mentioned? Because if the knowing and the intent was still not there, you knew that they planted sunflowers to shoot doves over, right?
Yeah, and again, every one of these scenarios is hard to sit here and give you an exact response because, number one, you have to go talk to those individuals, try to determine what their knowledge was, what their intent might be, and talk through those scenarios to see how to work through that. And probably the scenario that you're talking about, if it's that flagrant, then I could see that being a problem. That,
I would have been ticked off too.
No. I didn't put wheat out. I went through the process of planting sunflowers. I did it very legally. Yes.
They weren't baiting if they weren't hunting.
That's right.
But it doesn't matter. I knew what was going on and saw what they had done. Now I had constructive notice.
yes, sir.
And my actions, should I have shown up, and it been very clear that I knew, I was in jeopardy. Quite frankly, I walked away from that field. Okay? And I had money in it.
Right.
Not only did I walk away from it, all the damn birds flew over there. Okay? Doves. I say this, well, let me tell you something. That is that's real. So to sit here and say it hadn't happened, or maybe it has happened. It may not have been reported, and it can. That's what I'm trying to get this committee to think about. Are there mitigating issues putting somebody on notice? There are parts of the code section in here that you know nobody's looked at, I'm sure, in a while, but you know. Do you put a liability? When somebody's put on notice that you're doing something, don't put me in jeopardy of doing it. Okay? There's already code in here in the game section. You link it. Do you have enough power that when a scenario like that happens, that you now as a law enforcement, similar to what you've done with the dove, can go out and have the bait removed so that the other person who may be in jeopardy of hunting over bait?
Well, then you would have.
That's the question that I'm trying to get at this committee. It didn't matter if it happens, if it hadn't happened at all, which it has happened, but I had enough common sense and I respected the game laws and didn't want to get in trouble to move. But do we want one person to do this? That's my question, guys. Think about it. So that's what I'm trying to get this committee to start thinking about scenarios. Yeah. Yeah, we'll start.
Let me ask for y'all.
All right, hold on a second. All right.
Let me ask you.
Cousin,
My
cousin,
turn.
you can wait, you can wait.
There you go. Scenario here. Chairman Knight must have seen one of my properties. In Harris County, I had this happen actually. And what happened was where I'm sitting here hunting, there's a pine thicket. I use that pine thicket for pretty much cover. It's on the border of the land, but it's 30 yards wide and probably 100 yards long. They're pretty young pines, but I've set up several times because I'm calling the turkey off of a ridge to a field, and I'm on the edge of the field. Now, the guy that owned the property next to me died. His son put up a feeder, and I come out and scout. There's not a feeder, just happened I'm hunting. Okay, turkey comes down, I shoot the turkey, and hopefully I called the turkey better and he was coming to feed because I was set up a little bit not in a direct line of the feed. But then I just took the notion of, I noticed a big new trail coming in here and I thought, you know, that looks like more deer are traveling. I walked down through this thicket, there's a feeder 15 yards on the other side of the fence. Had no idea about it. If you caught me then with that bird, you're probably not gonna write me a ticket because you're gonna sit there and look at this thicket and understand that I probably didn't have any knowledge. Now, I could have had knowledge and I could have used that for a screen if I'm dishonest. The honesty is what you did, you know, you have to look at it. We either are honest or we're not. But I would say you wouldn't write me a ticket pretty much in that scenario. Am I
Most
right?
likely that's correct.
Because
Our
you're
officer
there
would
looking
go
at it.
in, let's say you're coming out, you've got the bird, our officer would go in, if they found the feeder there, they're gonna backtrack with you to where you killed that bird.
Right.
They're gonna look for the feathers that are there, possibly a spent shell if one's left, and determine where the bird was taken, and then make a determination of what you're talking about. That scenario happens, not the bait piece, but that scenario, just to see where that bird was killed, happens on probably a pretty regular basis now, bait or not.
Right. Now, I did another thing on another piece of property I had, and on the line, a guy did not want anybody to shoot his deer, shoot his turkey, so he had 3 feeders.
Set up.
One on each line, one in the center. With that, what I did was, I was gonna hunt the area because I knew the pattern of these deer pretty well, so what I did was, instead of hunting here by the feeder, I went 200 plus yards down on a creek bottom because I knew they funneled through there, but I did know there was bait there.
So you're
I coulda
200
put 'em-
yards and out of line of sight, you're good.
But if I was 110, but I positioned myself with some bushes, I couldn't see it, it's up to that officer still to interpret
And make
that.
yes.
Okay, and that's what I just,
But the next step after that is, and this is what I keep going back to, you now have noticed that it's there.
that's right. The integrity of me now comes into part of how I handle that.
You know, the question is, if you wanna continue to hunt your land, or let's say you did not shoot that turkey, but you did find out that there was a feeder, at what point, what do you do now?
I went and contacted the landowner and just told him, you know, I understand it's your land. Your father and I have gotten along great for years. Could you move that feeder a little bit further back to where, you know, 30 or 40 yards where I can't see it, because he had a little bit of growth there also. Not to tell him what to do on his land, and he did move that. But I was shocked when I
But
saw the
again,
feeder there.
turkey season is 60 days.
Right.
You can't hunt that again for 10 days. You know, maybe I'm barking up a tree, okay? I don't think I am. I think this is gonna end up coming back and biting us.
But what you're looking at is a way to codify some common sense. I get
Well,
that.
Well,
And
it's
that-
not, it's
that's
not
for
how
the
to,
committee to work through, I would say.
common sense you can't codify. But when you have
Agreed.
conflict of that, and I still think the migratory birds are, I'd like to see your case law, okay? But you still have an issue where somebody else, as we just said in this scenario, the original scenario, this person is out 10 days.
Very well could be, yes, sir. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And under law, you don't have anything in here that compels that guy to remove that feeder. The
On the other-
only part in here is doves. So again, it's not what about a nice neighbor, it's about the law. And that's what I'm trying to tell you guys, is that there needs to be some things in here. The other thing is maybe a notice, because there are some not nice neighbors. There are people who feud, okay? So you may have had a nice neighbor, but there are people who feud and are so mad at each other that they would do anything to jeopardize their neighbor or put them in jeopardy.
They might put feet up because they don't want you shooting their turkey.
That's
And that's
exactly
what
right.
one
And-
neighbor on the other side did.
Well, the other part, guys, and I hate to bring this up publicly, but when the antis get a hold of it, what do? Okay?
Get a hold of.
That's a whole
What-
nother bill.
No, it's not. This is the code section.
Well, I mean, the antis, you ain't gonna fix them with nothing hardly.
Guys, I'm trying to look at our family, our hunting family. So what do you do when your neighbor, who is a staunch anti-hunter, puts up the feed? What do you do in that scenario?
Far as we go, you know, we do try to mitigate those things. If there's no way to mitigate the conflicts, then what you're saying is true. That hunter on the adjoining property will have to figure out how to do it and be legal with it.
But
It
couldn't
does
that-
affect
Couldn't
it.
that happen now? I mean,
Yes.
that could happen now.
Yeah, it can.
Yes.
And that's the problem that we've got, and that's what I'm trying to get this committee to focus on. Because 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you wouldn't even thought about an anti-hunter or the sentiment that's out there. 20 years from now, it'll be a battle. That's what I'm trying to get everybody to think about within the scenario. Okay?
Mr. Chairman, question.
Hold on. Let's get the committee, and I'll recognize you. But let's get the committee first. Jason?
Mr. Chairman,
7?
There you go, 7. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to ask a question of you. Do you have an idea on something we
Yeah,
could do to maybe a possible solution, such as not being able to put the feeder on the property line or locate the hunter on the property line? I think it's a public safety issue. I mean, I know for a game warden, we've all, and a landowner, I've had the problem with people hanging a stand on a property line. And I had a good buddy of mine, a good buddy that I've turkey hunted with for years, got shot 3 years ago, walking down a property line. A guy from Florida leased the property next to him. I guess they thought he was a turkey. He's not the prettiest guy in the world, but he's 6'3", and I have never seen a 6'3" turkey. But anyway, he lost his eye, his right eye, and luckily he didn't get killed. But that's a public safety issue. I mean, I don't even think anybody should hunt right on the property line.
Well, that may be and that may be an opinion. I agree with you.
But that
There's
would be a
feuds that
potential
start 'cause
solution to this too. I mean,
the property I hunt on, I'm lucky enough to have a friend that has a large tract, and you can walk down every property line because he does things right, plants food. I mean, it's managed, and you can walk down the line and you can see where everybody's got a stand that's sitting on the fence. I mean, literally on the tree that splits the property line. Okay, that is an issue. Now, the safety issue, I'm not sure. I think that may be a whole different concept from what we're within this bill, within baiting. But I think it does, my issue is how do you mitigate some of this? From a law enforcement point of view, there's a lot of judgment that y'all are exercising. How do you mitigate this to make it a little more clear? Again, baiting within certain distances. That will help mitigate, I think, to a great extent. You did it on hogs. You just forgot to take it out on hogs on the Senate side, okay? But how do you do that? So that's one scenario that could hopefully mitigate some of the issues that we've talked about. The other thing is a notice. And a way to put on notice, and there's in code, I'm not sure I've printed it all out, but it's in the code. Let me see if I printed it out. (27.3.151). Interfere with the lawful taking of wildlife by another person by intentionally preventing or attempting to prevent such person for such lawful taking of wildlife, that code section. Disturb an activity. Fail to obey order of law enforcement to cease from a conduct. I mean, there's already some language in here, guys, that could be looked at and tied back to the issue that I'm talking about.
And that particular code section was put into place, it's been several years back for like an anti-hunting group, as you were referred to earlier. You know, there was a period of time in the country where anti-hunters would go through the woods, pots, pans, beating on them and all that. That code section was put into place to protect Georgia hunters from that activity and give us authority to stop that, especially on our state-owned properties or anything else if that occurred. That's where that code section got started, yes, sir.
But again, unfortunately, antis are against all hunting, but I've got hunters that are against hunters.
Sure.
Okay? It's but the other part of the code, the next 152, is there's injunctions for damages and violation. So if you've got a $15,000 dove field that's out there, or you put $15,000 in a duck swamp or whatever, and somebody puts you in jeopardy, is there a way to put notice and then tie back to this? Guys, just think. All I'm trying to do is protect the hunter and the guy that's lawfully trying to pursue game lawfully. Okay? There's some ideas. Y'all think about it. Y'all think about it. Dominique?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Henderson, I know that it's going to be kind of a two-part question. I just wanted to try to make sure we had clarity on it because of the hypothetical scenarios just really kind of, I think, at a minimum, kind of loses people. Currently, in Georgia, you can pour out corn, you can pour out wheat on a field, you can feed every animal out there, and it's not baiting unless you hunt on it.
That's correct, yes. You currently can feed in the state, yes.
It is illegal once you hunt on it.
Yes.
And the second part of the question is this. My understanding of this bill, as it relates to white-tailed deer only, not dove, not turkey, it moves the hunter about 200 yards and in plain sight of the feed.
Yes, sir. That's the change.
But
yes,
let me stop you there because you're incorrect in what you just said. You can only do it for deer. Go back to the code section.
Well, that's what he said. For
No,
deer.
no. You
White-tailed
said
deer
currently in Georgia you can feed any critter.
As long as you don't hunt on it, you can feed him.
You can feed.
You can feed
anything.
every animal as long as you don't sit over it with a gun to try to harvest them.
It
Or-
says
or a
over any where hunters are or will be hunting, and that's my point.
Or will
Dominique.
be hunting.
Okay?
But you answered my question. I appreciate that.
Hey, you want to entertain a motion?
No. Well, I think that there are holes in this. I'd like to see, Colonel, I'd like to see case law.
I'll
okay?
get you a
Both
copy of that.
federal and case law.
And we're talking about dove case law, correct?
No, I'm talking about, well, all of it,
Okay.
but ducks and dove, because ducks are at a
Migratory.
higher standard. I know there's a higher standard,
Yes, sir.
okay? And I want us to look at ways to mitigate with a growing state and a populated state, smaller land tracts, and prevent what's going on here.
Minimum acreage.
Well, we tried that. I mean, I tried that last time to do that.
I'll just ask you a question as far as not like on the, just kind of, if we try to mitigate in an overabundance of caution based on hypotheticals, are we not at risk of requiring DNR to use their current method of knowing and intentionally, or whatever those words?
Knowledge and intent.
Knowledge and intent of filling up your little probate and magistrate courts with people that are gonna have to hire lawyers potentially to work this out. If you tighten that up too much, you turn it into a jobs bill for lawyers. These guys probably keep 50%, would you say, of these cases from going? I'm sure it's probably a good number of them you figure out on your own with your law enforcement officer and work through all of that before the ticket's ever written.
Our goal is to have voluntary compliance, how we get to that, and that's from dealing with that individual, trying to determine, can we talk through this and it not occur again, or are we gonna have to have a citation issued to prevent it in the future? But we try to take the most moderate action to get to that point.
But with that being said in discussion, you're talking about a person who you've caught in direct violation of baiting. I'm talking about the property rights and the issue of one entrapping somebody else or putting somebody else at jeopardy. Okay?
Right.
And you've said that you haven't seen any other cases of it, so Dominique's making a point, if you tighten this up, you're gonna fill the courts. Well, if you're not seeing many cases of it, or very few of it, I don't know what you're seeing, because there's really not a record, an individual record, okay, or at least that I've seen, of the details of any of the engagements that you've had with this. Then I think that, you know, if there's not that many and you're arguing that many, don't tell me you're gonna flood the courts. I'm trying to protect the legal hunter and somebody's personal property
Well,
rights.
yeah, my point was probably not worded very well, but I think in all of the instances where law enforcement was talking to Dominic.
Well, Dominic was
They
just
had-
caught red-handed. I mean,
Yeah.
that's.
So they did use their discretion, whether, even speeding,
You're
for
not-
example,
hold on
they'll
a second.
say,
I'm not talking about the discretion with a person who has been caught in the act of baiting, okay? I'm talking about landowners and adjacent landowners and the ability for people to pursue other types of game when it comes into conflict with the fact that you can hunt deer and hogs over it, but you can't hunt the other, okay? That's what I'm trying to talk about. I'm not talking about you getting caught red-handed. That's where you're exercising judgment. So, Jason?
If it's all right, I was just wanting to see if maybe legislative council working in the Colonel would weigh in on if they have any suggested language that could address the issue, or just frankly, if you think it's worth even addressing the landline issue.
Well, from what I'm hearing with concerns here, that probably would be something good to look at. I'm hearing two different concerns here with landlines. One's where the bait's placed, if it's legal, in conjunction to the property line. And the other is, it's unassociated with baiting, but the distance a hunter needs to be from the line, especially for deer hunting. You know, if you look at a lot of the larger timber companies now, they're incorporating that into their lease.
Mhm.
The deer hunter stand has to be anywhere from 100 to 100 feet to 150 yards from the property line. That's two different things you're talking about here, but, you know, that is something that's a concern that comes up occasionally that our officers have to work through. We'll get the call, somebody's got their stand 10 feet off the line, they're looking onto my property, can you do something about it? And we have to work through those scenarios too. That's not a baiting issue, it's altogether a hunting without permission concern that they've got. And I don't know if that's your question you're asking, but that is
Yeah.
something that could be looked at to help in that one scenario.
So in your opinion, do you think it would be beneficial
Beneficial?
to move to have a regulation added to the code that says that the hunter can't hunt on the property line and and you have a recommended yardage?
Well, I would say that from a deer hunting standpoint, with a deer stand and where it can be located, that would be beneficial for us. It's not like an overwhelming issue we have, but we do get those calls every year. And this goes back to probably landowner rights or whatever. This guy's got a stand 10, and probably some of you've had similar scenarios, but anybody that's hunted any amount of time has probably had that on the hunting club. That could prove beneficial from a hunting standpoint, hunting without permission, and the landowner right issue that I'm hearing here.
Jason, I don't like it, but that's his tree. I don't like it when they hunt on my property lines, but that's his dirt. That is his, the constitutional amendment he keeps talking about. The reason we voted for it was to protect that hunter's right to hunt on his land or where he has permission to hunt. And if you take one tree away from his ability to put a stand, you just took away private property rights. Now, on land leases, I'm leasing you my land, I can call the
You can
shots.
spell out what you want.
But that is a very dangerous, I want David to hunt every inch of his duck field. When he plants them sunflowers, I want him to hunt right to the wire, to the light wire, because that's where I shoot them when they land right there.
I believe there's something in code about shooting off a light wire too, isn't there?
Public road, yes, sir.
No, not on a public road, just out in the.
But in reality, what you're saying in what this scenario, if I don't hunt, I own the land beside David, I don't know anything about baiting, I don't know anything about any of that, but if I wanna go throw out sunflower seeds and corn and I wanna feed the bugs and the squirrels and everything, I mean, that's what I'm saying, we could do that, that could happen now. And if you take that away, say, I can't do this on, with 100 yards of my line, and you can't come within 100 yards of your line, I mean, that's a big block of land that you're taking away.
Well, let's
no,
just move the
there's-
feeder then.
There's a difference from hunting and baiting.
But yeah, but
And-
with your scenarios, I could go out and feed everything on my land, and
And
you're
basically,
gonna have to buy that land.
no, because first of all, we've got a constitutional amendment to hunt, right, and hunt and fish.
But they've got a
Okay.
right to do that on their land.
No, they don't. Not in, that's what we determine as a body with in code and the interference of others. It's just like we put in for the antis, okay? That's what you're not getting. I will, as chairman of this committee, as long as I'm chairman of this committee, will absolutely fight tooth and nail for hunting and fishing. That is a heritage, that is the constitutional, that was passed by the people, and nothing will come before that as long as I'm here, and I don't think even you or anybody else. If you look at history, before there was any baiting, what was the law? It's illegal to bait for entice, okay? And there were two parts to it. That's what I'm saying we need to look at. This is not just the easy.
Dove, I totally agree.
Well, dove, duck, but
I totally
the
agree
colonel
on
just
that.
said, even in my scenario there, he has lost his right to hunt for 10 days after he sees that and has notice. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I mean, is that not true, Colonel? I mean, under that scenario, he sees it, he's got knowledge, or even you show up and use exercise great judgment. Emery, I know you're a good guy, you didn't see it. I'm putting you on notice right now. There's a feeder over there. You can't hunt here. What is he to do? You wanted to fight for that guy's right to hunt out of that tree stand because it was deer hunting. What about his right to go hunt his field for turkeys? It's the same thing, guys. When you boil it down, it's the same exact thing.
Emery needs a hunting buddy like me that'll help him with the story.
No, well, no, don't make it. You were very passionate about the right to hunt a tree.
Well, I mean, what I would just do.
I'm very passionate about, I'm
Well,
very
let's
passionate.
let's move the feeder away from the property line.
I'm very passionate about him getting to hunt his property. I'm very passionate about him not being able to have to lose 10 days of a 60-day turkey season.
Well, can we come up, I'm fine, why can't we come up with a limitation of where you can put a feeder with a property line?
Right.
Look, guys, I wanted to have an adult discussion about this.
Well, that's what we're doing.
That's what we're
Well,
doing.
finally, we're finally getting to the point where we're having an adult discussion about it.
What distance you recommend? 100
I
yards?
don't know. That's what. That's
I
what we're-
recommend 100 yards from the property line.
Just don't bring your bag of corn up here.
Well, let me
You
tell
can
let me
give
tell
it.
what
Hey,
you
you
just
can give it
proved.
to the rules chairman back
Let me
there. He
tell
may
you-
need it.
Let me tell you what you just proved with what was that, intent and
Knowledge and intent.
knowledge and intent. See, you thought I brought this in here to make you mad, but I didn't. They bet me I couldn't carry this bag of corn four flights up these stairs, and when I got up here, I didn't have nowhere else to put it, so I brought it in here to keep it safe, and kept it safe down there. So that just goes to prove about intent, and you gotta have investigation to find that intent where I was going. Now, second thing, I'm the only freaking guy in here from North Georgia that ain't got deer hunting, and ain't nobody asked me one question about anything. You wanna talk about, what is it, CWD?
CWD.
Is that not the same thing as scrappies that the adults get?
I don't think it is. Is
It
John?
is. It's the.
CDC
Yeah,
says
Is
it
it
is.
similar?
Same exact thing.
it's what
It is
affects the
not
sheep.
the exact same thing. It is in the same family of diseases, transmissible.
That's what affects
spongiform
the sheep.
encephalopathies.
Yeah, that worked. Does it not come from water? That's what the CDC says. It's transferred through water, where they use the bathroom in the water and all that good stuff. Is where it's transferred through.
As I mentioned, whether it's scrapie for sheep, CWD for deer, that infectious protein is in all bodily fluids, all nervous tissue. So wherever those body fluids are sneezed, spit, drool, excreted, whatever that is, it becomes contaminated. If it's water,
Right.
it'll be in the water.
So it spreads faster through water, I guess, than to be what their thoughts are. and their-
Common with sheep.
Yeah. All right. So if we don't have any problems with this, we're trying to figure out if North Georgia, we put together a rural development council that goes out and tries to figure out how to do economic development. Well, all my guys is driving 400 miles to South Georgia leasing land because they can bait down there and we can't up there. And so it gets to be an issue of, we can go through all these scenarios, what ifs and all that stuff. Why would I put my feeder 10 yards from his line? Cause all he's gonna do is shoot my deer. If I put it 10 yards from his property line, and you can't stop. Huh? Yeah, I mean, or I put it 10 yards from my property line to draw his deer. over on me.
Representative,
But-
you're talking. Everything's going back to deer. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm
This
saying.
is not about just deer. It's about all hunting.
But
Okay.
But this bill is it not about baiting deer?
It is about the consideration of the conflict between all. You haven't listened to the conversation.
No, I went through a filibuster. I mean, because we went through all this, if a comet lands and blows up something and all that. What about the baiting deer in North Georgia? That's what the bill's about.
No, let me tell you, I told you in the beginning to have an adult conversation about the issues that are within baiting. It's about trying to fix some things that were within baiting before you double down on it. It was also about taking and making sure everyone understands the risk of CWD and other diseases. Because you want to talk about economic development, I'll tell you what will happen with economic development once CWD hits either North Georgia or South Georgia, and all of a sudden there are no deer hunters. There won't be any economic development, and there'll be a whole lot of loss. We've seen that in other states, so that's not an arguable point.
Well, I'll tell you what is arguable.
Whoa!
I'm an adult.
You're getting out of hand. I'm having an adult conversation here. You're going back to something that I asked people to have an adult conversation about.
Can we get on the little 50-foot thing or whatever they would?
I think there are a couple things that I'd like to consider.
That's what
Okay?
I'd like to hear is your
Okay?
recommendation.
I'd like to consider distance. I think there's inherent things within the code, okay, that hogs difference, okay? I think there needs to be language that gives the Department of Natural Resources just like they do in Doves, the ability to tell someone to move it, okay?
Yeah.
And I think also I wanna look at a notice issue. Whether we can work through that, we'll see. But I
agree
think at
completely.
least, now we're at least starting to think about this. And again, Eddie, I wanna say something to you and the commissioner and the department. It's not your judgment that's in doubt here.
Oh,
I wish
understand
your
completely.
judgment was here for 10 and 15 and 20 years from now. We'd have we got common sense judgment in the way that y'all are doing something. I wanna say that publicly. It's not about that. It's about the next guy that's gonna interpret this a whole lot differently than what you're interpreting it. I would like to see what the federal issues are with the migratory. And if you don't mind getting that, I would
I will
appreciate
get
it.
that for you, yes, sir.
Okay?
Thank
I
you, Mr.
appreciate it.
Chairman.
I appreciate it. We'll start putting our heads together. Guys, thank y'all. I know this is heated, but
I would, just kind of off the record again, just kind of sitting here, on the distance away from the landline, I still struggle with trying to tell somebody what they can do on their own land, so I'd like for that to be as minimal as possible, but I like Jason said.
about is leaving it up to DNR to be able to.
DNR to don't move it or tell them where to, if they're too close to the line.
I love that.
I like that. That takes it out of our hands and lets DNR handle it.
Cause I have some guys that, well, hey, Jason lives, you live, what, you back up to a bombing range or something, don't you?
That'd be me.
And so he should be able to, you should be able to put that feeder right on the line, and nobody, that's your land.
Nobody has no my property.
But you know what I'm saying? You might have a piece of land that borders up